The mud on my boots was still wet from the morning site visit when the attorney finished reading and my father stood up and said, "This is what she wanted." We all agree. I had driven straight from a farm property inspection in Grayson County to the attorney's office in Lewisburg. I hadn't had time to change. I had walked into that conference room in my work coat with Marshall County clay on my boots and taken the chair nearest the door, and I had sat with my hands in my lap and listened while a man I had never met read my grandmother Mabel's will aloud to 11 people. The will he read named my brother Derek as sole beneficiary of the house on Caldwell Road and the savings account associated with it. My name appeared once. In a clause about personal property. Specifically, the cedar hope chest in the back bedroom and the contents thereof. My father said, "This is what she wanted." We all agree, and looked at the room rather than at me, and people began gathering their coats. I didn't say anything. I kept my hands in my lap. Kept my face still. I looked at the table. There were 11 people in that room. 7 of them were cousins I saw twice a year. One was my Uncle Gerald, who had driven up from Bowling Green and who, I noticed, did not look surprised. One was my brother Derek, who was 38 and who worked in equipment sales in Elizabethtown and who, when the attorney had read his name as sole beneficiary, had not reacted at all. Not a blink. Not a breath caught. Nothing. I noticed that. I picked up my copy of the will, folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I stood up. I walked out. I was 3 steps from my truck in the parking lot when I heard fast footsteps on the pavement behind me. My name is Raylan. I was 33 years old that morning and I was an agricultural loan officer at First Marshall Bank, which meant I spent my days reading financial documents and assessing risk and knowing when a number did not match the story being told about it. The number in that will did not match the story my family had been telling for 3 years. The footsteps were my Aunt Sylvia. She was 62 years old and she had been my grandmother's closest sister, and she had driven 4 hours from Lexington to be in that room. She grabbed my sleeve before I reached the door handle. She looked past me at the building entrance. Then she pulled me 2 steps further from it and lowered her voice. She said, "Your name was removed 8 months ago." I watched them do it. I was in the house. Kept my face still. I said, "Tell me." My grandmother Mabel Creech had lived on Caldwell Road in Lewisburg for 53 years. She had moved into that house as a 29-year-old woman with a husband, 2 small children, and $900 in a checking account. She had outlasted the husband by 19 years and the mortgage by 11. She had spent the final decade of her life in a house that was paid off and completely hers. She was not a wealthy woman. What she had was what she had built. The house on Caldwell Road sat on 1.4 acres with a detached workshop and a small rental unit above the workshop. A 1-bedroom apartment that had been rented continuously since 1998, first to a mechanic named Darnell who stayed 7 years, then to a series of quiet tenants. Most recently a nursing student named Petra who paid $312 a month and kept the place immaculate. My grandmother had used the rental income for property taxes and utilities and had never mentioned it to anyone in the family as anything other than the apartment money. She treated it like a utility, something that ran quietly in the background and kept the rest of the system working. She had told me about it when I was 26. Not as a secret. As a fact. She had sat me down at her kitchen table with the lease agreement and the tax records and a yellow legal pad where she had tracked every payment since 1998, and she had said, "I want you to know how this works. In case something happens to me and nobody else knows." She did not call Derek in for that conversation. I understood why at the time and said nothing about it. My grandfather Raymond had built the rental unit himself over 2 summers in the mid-1980s. He had been deliberate about it. Not a grand gesture, just a quiet, practical decision. He worked at the County Cooperative Extension Office for 22 years, advising farmers on soil health and crop rotation, and he had the particular patience of a man who understood that the value of a thing was built slowly and maintained carefully. He had known, my grandmother told me once, that the women in his family paid closer attention than the men, and that the wisest thing a man could do was acknowledge that fact while he was living and make his arrangements accordingly. He had left my grandmother the house, the savings, and a simple will that named her as sole decision-maker for everything that came after. She had taken that responsibility seriously. My grandfather had also left something less tangible, a way of watching people. Not suspiciously, just carefully. He had the ability to look at a situation and see not just what was in front of him but what the situation would become in 5 years if nothing changed. My grandmother had inherited this from him, or perhaps they had grown it together over 41 years of marriage. Either way, she could read the shape of things, and she had read the shape of her family clearly by the time she was 70. What she saw was this: Derek was not careless exactly. He just did not pay attention to the kind of details that determined whether a piece of property stayed solvent. He had borrowed $31,500 from my grandmother in 2018. I knew the number because she had shown me the promissory note she had written herself in her own handwriting, which Derek had signed, and he had repaid $8,000 of it before the repayments stopped, and my grandmother had never brought it up again. That was her way. She did not chase people. She noted things and moved on. She noted a great many things. My father had a different quality. He was organized, attentive, and genuinely fond of managing things, including things that were not his to manage. He had always treated family finances as a collective project even when the assets in question were not collectively owned. He was the kind of man who believed that stepping in to help was the same as being asked to help, and who had never, in my experience, been corrected on that point by anyone in a position to correct him. I had not been in a position to correct him. I was the youngest. I was the one who had moved away to college on a combination of scholarships and part-time work, who had taken the bank job in Marshall County rather than coming back to the family orbit in Elizabethtown, who had spent 6 years building a professional life that had very little to do with what anyone in my family expected of me. What I did not watch my grandmother do because I was not there was sign a document 8 months before her death that removed my name from her will. I know now what happened. Aunt Sylvia told me in the parking lot, and I have since confirmed it through documents and through a conversation with the attorney who drafted the amendment. What happened was this. My father visited my grandmother in March when she had been in and out of the hospital twice and when her cardiologist had begun using language about quality of life rather than treatment outcomes. My father sat with her for an afternoon. My brother Derek was there for part of it. At some point, Aunt Sylvia did not see the whole of it, only the end. My grandmother signed a document. Aunt Sylvia had been in the kitchen. She had come to the doorway when she heard the notary's voice. She had seen my grandmother's hand on the pen. She had seen my father collect the document. She had seen Derek look at the window. She had not said anything then. She told me that she had not known what to do with what she had seen, and that she had told herself perhaps it was routine. Something about medical directives. A healthcare proxy. Something that did not affect what came later. It had affected what came later. I had not known any of this on the March afternoon it happened because I was in Lewisburg doing my job. I was an agricultural loan officer. I assessed farm and land loans, viability, risk, repayment structure. I spent my days sitting across from people who had built something with their hands and needed someone to look at the numbers honestly and tell them what they could carry and what would break them. I was good at it. I had been doing it for 6 years and I had a reputation in Marshall and surrounding counties for being thorough and fair and for never telling someone what they wanted to hear when the number said something different. That skill had not come from a classroom. It had come from years of sitting at kitchen tables with people who had more at stake than they could say out loud, reading documents line by line, and learning to spot the place where the story someone told and the document they signed did not match. The place in my grandmother's amended will where the story and the document did not match was the signature itself. I knew her handwriting. I had been reading her handwriting my entire life. Grocery lists, birthday cards, the yellow legal pad with the rental records. The signature on the amendment, which I obtained a copy of 3 days after the reading, had the correct letter forms but not the correct pressure. Her arthritis had been in her right hand since 2020. Her signature in 2023 had a particular unevenness to it, a slight drag on the final letters. The signature on the amendment did not have that drag. That was not proof of anything in itself. But it was a question. I had been paying my grandmother's medical co-pays for 3 years without telling anyone. Not large amounts, co-insurance on her cardiology appointments, the physical therapy she had needed after her hip replacement, 2 dental procedures that Medicare did not cover. I had paid them directly to the billing departments, had asked to be listed as the secondary contact on her accounts, and had told my grandmother only that I wanted to help and that she should not mention it to anyone because it was not anyone else's business. She had accepted this without argument. She was a practical woman. She said, "You always were the one who showed up." Total over 3 years, $14,800. Not in a lump sum, in small payments, $200 here for $100 there, Nothing that looked like anything if you weren't tracking it. I had tracked it. I had the bank statements, my own account records, going back to the first payment in January 2020. I had kept them in a folder in my filing cabinet at home, not because I expected to need them, but because I was an agricultural loan officer and I did not throw away documentation. That folder was the first thing I thought of when Aunt Sylvia finished telling me what she had seen. The second thing I thought of was the yellow legal pad. The rental records. My grandmother's handwriting on every line. My grandmother had told me where those records were. She had shown me, specifically, the drawer in her study where she kept the lease agreements and the payment log and the tax filings for the rental income. She had said, if something happens to me and someone tries to say the apartment money doesn't exist, you'll know where to look. I had thought at the time that she was being characteristically thorough. Standing in the parking lot in Lewisburg with mud on my boots and Aunt Sylvia's hand still on my sleeve, I understood she had been giving me instructions. That was the history. This is what happened the Thursday after the reading. My father called at 7:40 in the evening. I was at my kitchen table with the copy of the amended will in front of me and a yellow legal pad of my own, not my grandmother's, mine, where I had been writing down everything Aunt Sylvia had told me in order, with times and dates as best she could remember them. He said, Raylan, I know today was hard. I want you to understand that Mama made this decision herself. Nobody pushed her. She wanted the house to stay in one piece and she felt Derek was in the better position to manage it. Kept my voice even. When was the amendment drafted? Pause. She made some updates in the spring. I helped her find an attorney in Bowling Green to handle it. An attorney in Bowling Green, I said. Not her regular attorney. Another pause. Longer. She wanted someone neutral, he said. I wrote that down on my legal pad. Neutral. His word. I said, okay. He took that as agreement. I let him. After he hung up, I sat at the table for a while. Then I opened my filing cabinet and pulled the folder with the bank statements. 3 years of payment records. I set it on the table next to the legal pad. Then I drove to my grandmother's house. I had always had a key, and I went to the study and opened the drawer she had showed me, and I took out the yellow legal pad with the rental records, the lease agreements going back to 1998, and the most recent tax filings for the rental income. I brought them home and added them to the table. If you've ever been told that a decision was made for your benefit about something you built or something someone left you, by people who did not ask you and did not tell you and presented it afterward as settled fact, you know the particular kind of stillness that comes over you. It is not defeat. It is the moment before you start working. I called a woman named Louise Hatcher on Friday morning. Louise was an estate and probate attorney in Bowling Green, not the same firm my father had used, and I had referred clients to her twice when agricultural loans had intersected with estate complications. She answered her own phone before 9. I told her I needed an appointment that week. She gave me Tuesday at 2. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building on College Street, with a waiting room that smelled like old upholstery and a window that looked out over the parking garage. She had 2 diplomas on the wall and a credenza stacked with Kentucky probate code volumes that had yellow tabs sticking out of them in clusters, which told me she used them for reference rather than display. I set the folder of bank statements on her desk. I set the rental records next to them. I set the amended will on top. I told her everything Aunt Sylvia had told me and everything my father had said on the phone. She read without speaking. She turned pages slowly. When she finished the amended will, she set it down and looked at it for a moment. The drafting attorney, she said. Do you know his name? I gave her the name my father had mentioned. She wrote it down. Different firm from the original will, she said. It was not a question. Yes. She picked up the rental records. She looked at the dates. She looked at the tax filings. She looked at my bank statements. She set them down in a stack. The signature question you mentioned, she said. That's difficult to prove without expert analysis. But it's not the only question here. She opened her own notepad. A will amendment signed by a grantor with documented cardiac disease, in the presence of family members who stood to benefit, drafted by an attorney introduced to the grantor by those family members rather than retained independently. That's a set of facts a court looks at carefully, particularly if the grantor's prior stated intentions are documented. I said, she told me specifically twice that the house was mine when she was gone. Once in 2019 at the kitchen table. Once in 2021 on the phone. Is there anyone else who heard either of those conversations? Aunt Sylvia, I said. For the 2019 one. She was in the house. Louise wrote that down. Hey. And the rental income. Your grandmother never mentioned it to the rest of the family. Not to my knowledge. So Derek and your father may not have known about it. I don't think they did, I said. Which means they also don't know I have the records. Louise looked at me for a moment with the particular stillness of a person reassessing a situation. She said, the rental records established 25 years of active property management your grandmother conducted independently. The lease agreements are in her handwriting. The tax filings are in her name. If the estate claims the property is straightforwardly Derek's, these records introduce a question about what the decedent understood herself to be passing on, and to whom. She paused. The payment records you kept are corroborating evidence of a relationship with the decedent that was materially different from what the family is describing. I said, what does that give us? It gives us the basis for a formal challenge to the amendment, she said. On grounds of undue influence potentially. And on the question of testamentary intent. It won't be certain. But it's not nothing. It's considerably more than nothing. She turned to a fresh page. Here's what I want to build, she said. She told me. I listened. When she was done I asked 3 questions. She answered each one directly without hedging more than the situation warranted. I signed the retainer at the end of the meeting and shook her hand at the door. If you've ever sat across from someone who looked at your documents and told you that what you had was real and that it was worth fighting for, you know what that moment feels like. You don't cry. You don't feel relieved exactly. You feel the ground come back under you. Solid. Level. Something you can stand on. Over the following week I did 3 things. I drove back to Caldwell Road and photographed the rental unit and the workshop and the property pins on the east boundary, which I had helped my grandmother locate and mark with survey tape in 2021 because the neighboring property had been sold and the new owner had questions. I met with Louise a second time and reviewed the formal challenge filing line by line, correcting 2 dates and adding a detail about the notary that Louise's paralegal had missed. I drafted a formal letter to Petra, my grandmother's current tenant, introducing myself as the contact person for the property during the estate process and asking her to continue her current lease terms and direct any correspondence to me. Petra wrote back the next day. She said she hoped the family was doing okay. She said she had loved living there. She said my grandmother had been kind. I kept that letter. The night before Louise filed the formal challenge, a Friday 2 weeks after the reading, my Aunt Sylvia called. She called at 9:30. She said, I've been thinking about what I should have done in that room in March. I keep going back to it. I said, you told me. That's what mattered. She talked about you all the time, Sylvia said. You know that. Every time I called her, she'd tell me what you were doing. The loan work, the clients you'd helped, the farm over in Edmonson County you'd saved from going under. She was proud of you in a way she didn't always say out loud. Sylvia paused. She told me once. This was years ago. She said, Sylvia, Raylan is the one who shows up and doesn't make a production of it. Those are the people you trust with the important things. I kept the phone against my ear. Kept my voice even. She said that. More than once, Sylvia said. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, get some sleep. I'll call you when it's done. I sat at my kitchen table after I hung up. The bank statements were in a folder on the left side of the table. The rental records were in a folder on the right. In the center was a manila envelope Louise had couriered over that afternoon, with the challenge filing inside and a sticky note on the front that said, Court date, 9 a.m. Marshall County. You're ready. I looked at it for a while. I wasn't thinking about Derek. I wasn't thinking about my father. I was thinking about my grandmother at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, tracking every payment in her careful handwriting since 1998. Writing everything down. Keeping everything in the drawer. Knowing someone would need to know where to look. She had known it would be me. In the morning I was up before 6. I made coffee and didn't drink much of it. I showered and put on the navy blazer I wore to loan closings. Not because it was formal, but because it was the thing I wore when I needed to feel like myself in a room where someone was going to try to tell me I was wrong about the numbers. I had worn it to 3 hearings and 2 mediations and 1 very difficult conversation with a farmer in Butler County who didn't want to hear what his cash flow actually said. I had worn it every time I needed to be the person in the room who stayed level no matter what the other side did. I set the folders on the kitchen table. Bank statements on the left. Rental records on the right. The manila envelope from Louise in the center, still sealed, the sticky notes still on it. I checked them once. Then I checked them again. Then I put them in my leather document bag in the order I would need them and set the bag by the door. The hearing was at 9 at the Marshall County Courthouse in Lewisburg. I had 40 minutes of driving. I had not eaten breakfast. I noticed this somewhere around the Woodburn grain elevator and filed it away as something to address after. There was a diner on the square in Lewisburg that I had been to twice, and I had already decided that when this was over I would go there and sit in a booth and eat eggs and not think about anything important for 20 minutes. That was the plan I was holding in the back of my mind for the whole drive. Not the hearing. Not the documents. Not what my father would say when he saw me walk in. The eggs. The booth. The 20 minutes of nothing. It is a useful thing to have a small specific plan for afterward. Keeps the before from getting too large. I took Route 68 west out of Bowling Green. I passed the grain elevator outside Woodburn without looking at it. I passed the feed store where I had done a site visit in October and the county road turnoff I had taken to the Caldwell Road property twice in the past 2 weeks. I did not turn. Kept going. I thought about my grandmother as I drove. Not the estate, not the records, not the legal strategy. Just her. The way she had looked at her yellow legal pad with the rental payments and said, "This is how this works," as if explaining something simple. The way she had said, "You're the one who shows up and doesn't make a production of it," as if that were the most natural thing in the world to say and she couldn't understand why she'd need to say it at all. I thought about her handwriting on the envelope in the cedar chest. I thought, she knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote my name on it. The radio came on when I started the car. I turned it off after 2 minutes. I did not need sound. I needed the particular quiet of a drive where you already know what you are going to do and you are simply getting yourself to the place where you will do it. The courthouse in Lewisburg smelled like radiator heat and old paper. December cold had settled into the stone of the building and the radiators were fighting it without quite winning. I arrived at 8:43. Louise was already in the hallway outside the hearing room in her gray coat, with her briefcase open on a bench, reviewing something. She looked up when she heard my boots on the floor. "You ready?" she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "They're already inside. Your father and Derek and their attorney. Derek brought someone else, woman I don't recognize, sitting in the back row." I filed that away. "Okay. The judge is Honorable Patricia Ware. She runs a tight room. No speeches. Answer what's asked." I said I understood. Louise closed her briefcase. We walked in together. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom. A long table, a raised bench at the front, chairs along the wall for observers. My father was seated on the far side of the table in a button-down shirt that told me he had dressed deliberately, the same way I had. Derek was next to him in a sport coat, his hands flat on the table. Their attorney, a man I didn't know, 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, was arranging papers at the table's end. Aunt Sylvia was in the second chair along the wall. She had driven from Lexington again. She met my eyes when I came in and gave me a single small nod. Derek looked at the table when I sat down. My father looked at me. His expression was careful. Composed. I read the room in the 3 seconds before I set my bag on the floor. They had come prepared to manage me. I could see it in the way their attorney's papers were arranged, in the way my father had positioned himself across from my chair, in the way Derek's hands were flat and deliberate. They had prepared for a grieving granddaughter who had been left out of a will and was causing trouble. They had not prepared for a loan officer with 3 years of documented payment records and an attorney who had tried this argument before. Hit subscribe, because what happens in the next few minutes is the part one most want you to hear. Judge Ware came in at 9:03. She set her reading glasses on her nose and opened the file without preamble. "This is an informal hearing on a contested will amendment," she said. "I've reviewed the filings. We're here to establish whether there is sufficient basis to advance a formal challenge. I'll hear from petitioner's counsel first." Louise stood. She was methodical and unhurried. She laid out the facts in the order we had built them. The original will, the amendment, the timeline, the conditions under which the amendment was signed. She did not editorialize. She cited the probate code sections and set them down. When she finished, the opposing attorney stood. His name was Calloway. He was smooth and unhurried in the way of a man who had done this many times and expected the outcome to be what it usually was. He said the amendment was properly executed. He said the grantor had been of sound mind. He said the grantor's wishes were clear and that the family had honored them. He said the petitioner's claims were the result of disappointment rather than any legal deficiency. He said my grandmother had been generous to me throughout her life and that the bequest of the Hope chest and its contents reflected her affection for me specifically. He said all of this calmly and with the particular confidence of a man who had been told by his clients that there was nothing here to find. I kept my hands in my lap. Kept my face still. I waited. Then my father spoke. He had not been asked to speak. Judge Ware looked at him briefly and Calloway touched his arm, but he continued. He said, Raylan has always been the one who needed more support from this family than she's wanted to admit. We helped her. We all did. This is hard for her, I understand that, but Mama made her choice. Raylan needs to let it go. The room was very quiet after he said that. Judge Ware looked at him over her reading glasses and then looked at Louise. Louise said, Your Honor, petitioner would like to enter 3 documents into the record. Judge Ware nodded. I reached into my bag. I took out the first folder. The bank statements, 3 years of them, paper-clipped in chronological order with the relevant transactions highlighted in yellow. I took it out slowly, holding the clip so the pages wouldn't fan. I unfolded it, the cover page first, then the tab sections, and laid it flat on the table in front of Louise, who set it in front of the judge. The header read, Raylan Creech, First Marshall Bank, account ending 4471, January 2020 through December 2022. I reached in again. I took out the second folder, the rental records. The yellow legal pad, photocopied page by page with my grandmother's handwriting on every line going back to 1998. The lease agreements. The tax filings. I unfolded it and laid it flat. I reached in a third time. I took out the manila envelope and removed the contents. Louise's formal filing with the appended sworn statement from Aunt Sylvia, and a 1-page summary of the payment history cross-referenced against the bank statements. I laid it flat. Louise addressed the judge. Your Honor, the bank statements document 41 payments made by petitioner directly to Marshall County Medical Center and associated billing departments on behalf of the decedent, totaling $14,800 over 36 months. The decedent's rental income records, in her own handwriting, document 25 years of active property management. The petitioner was specifically shown these records by the decedent and designated as the person who would know where they were kept. Louise paused. The amended will makes no mention of the rental unit or its income. It is our position that the decedent's intent, as established by her own documented records and the sworn testimony of a witness present in the home, was inconsistent with the amendment as filed. Calloway said, Your Honor, this is circumstantial. A granddaughter paid some medical bills. That doesn't. 25 years of rental records, Louise said, in the decedent's handwriting, kept in a drawer she specifically showed the petitioner and told her to look in if something went wrong. That is not circumstantial. That is instruction. The room was quiet. Calloway turned to the table. He looked at his notes. He began to assemble a response. Something about the legal sufficiency of a witness statement given 4 hours after the fact. Something about the distinction between what a grantor showed someone and what she formally intended. He was building toward an argument. Judge Ware let him start. She set her pen down on the folder in front of her and looked at him over her reading glasses. Counsel, she said, I've reviewed the rental income records. The ledger goes back to 1998. The most recent entry is dated November of last year, 4 months before the decedent's death. She was still managing this property at 78 years old. He picked up the bank statements. 41 separate transactions over 36 months, each one to a specific medical billing department. This is not a pattern consistent with someone who expected to receive nothing. Calloway adjusted his position. Your Honor, the amendment was properly notarized. The grantor's signature is noted, she said. She set the bank statements down. What I am looking at is a picture of the decedent's stated intentions as reflected in her actions over a period of years. That picture does not match the amendment as presented. My father's hands moved slightly on the table. He caught himself. He went still again. Derek's jaw had gone tight. I could see it from where I sat, the small clench, the muscle at the corner. His hands, which had been flat on the table, had moved. His left hand was now a fist on his knee, which was below the table level, which he may have thought no one could see. I could see it. My father had gone still in the particular way of a person who has just understood that the conversation is not going the way they planned. His face had not changed expression exactly, but the certainty had left it. His shoulders had settled. His hands were at the table's edge and he was not moving them. Judge Ware set the file down and looked at the room over her reading glasses. "I've seen enough to advance this to formal hearing," she said. "Petitioner's evidence establishes a sufficient factual basis." She looked at Calloway. "Counsel, I'd recommend your clients consider whether they want this to go further." She set the file down. I looked at my father. He was looking at the table. I said, "You said I always needed more support than I wanted to admit." He didn't answer. "You were right that I never asked for it," I said. "I paid $14,800 in 3 years without saying anything to anyone. I drove to Caldwell Road when the neighbor's survey question came up, and I spent a Saturday morning locating property pins with a woman who was 78 years old and still wanted to know exactly where her land ended. Kept my voice even. That's not needing support. That's showing up." I stood. I picked up my bag. I left the documents with Louise. My father looked up when I stood. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they miscalculated. Not guilty. Not sorry. Just recalculated. Derek did not look up at all. I walked to where Aunt Sylvia was sitting. I put my hand on her shoulder for one moment. Then I walked out. In the hallway the radiator was still fighting the December cold. I put on my coat. I stood there for a moment and breathed. Louise came out 2 minutes later. She said, "Calloway asked for a recess before we left the room. That's a settlement conversation." "I know," I said. She looked at me. "You did well in there." I said, "I had good records." She almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "You did." Louise came back inside the hearing room briefly after the recess was called. I waited in the hallway and heard through the door the particular sound of a conversation that has shifted key. Lower, more careful, the pauses longer. Calloway's voice. Then my father's, shorter than I expected. Then silence. Derek did not speak. I noticed that even from the hallway. In the 90 seconds I stood there before Aunt Sylvia came out, I did not hear Derek's voice once. That told me something. Derek had understood what happened in that room faster than my father had. My father was still recalibrating. Derek had already arrived at the conclusion. When Sylvia came into the hallway she had her coat over her arm and her keys in her hand. She had driven 4 hours twice in 3 weeks for this. She had sat in that chair along the wall for 40 minutes and had not said a word and had been the most important person in the room. I said, "Thank you for driving up." She said, "You don't have to thank me." "I know," I said. "I'm doing it anyway." She put her arm through mine and we went toward the door. Behind us, through the hearing room door, I heard my father say something I couldn't make out. Then Calloway's voice, measured and careful, walking him through what the options were now. I did not stop to listen. I already knew what the options were. I had known for 6 weeks. That was the difference between us. I had been 3 steps ahead since the parking lot after the reading, since Aunt Sylvia had grabbed my sleeve and told me what she saw. I pushed through the door into the cold. Inside the hearing room, through the closed door, I could hear the low sound of voices. My father and Derek and their attorney recalibrating. Counting what they had and what they didn't have and what it would cost to keep going. That was not my problem anymore. Aunt Sylvia came out and stood next to me. She didn't say anything. She just stood there. After a moment she took my arm and we walked down the hallway together, our footsteps even on the old floor, out through the door and into the cold December morning. 6 weeks later, Calloway contacted Louise with a settlement proposal. The amendment would be set aside. The original will would stand. Derek would remain in the trust for the personal property my grandmother had designated to him. The house on Caldwell Road and the rental unit would pass to me as sole beneficiary. My grandmother's original will had said exactly that. The one my father had helped amend 8 months before she died. He said I always needed more support than I wanted to admit. I thought about that while I was driving to Caldwell Road at 7 in the morning to document the property pins. I thought about it while I was writing a 41-line payment log in a legal pad at my kitchen table. I thought about it in the hearing room when you were looking at the floor. You said this is what she wanted and we all agree. I thought about that every time I opened the drawer she showed me, the one she said to look in if something went wrong. She had been very specific about that. She had said if something goes wrong. She had known the possibility existed. You said the hope chest and its contents were a reflection of her affection for me. You were right. What was in the chest was a sealed envelope with my name on it and instructions that made everything that came after possible. The papers were filed in February. That was enough. The people in your life who decide you can be managed have already told you everything you need to know about them. They've told you they haven't been paying attention. They've told you they don't know what you've been doing quietly for years without making a production of it. That is not your disadvantage. That is your whole position. If you've ever been the one who showed up without being asked, who kept the records nobody knew you were keeping, who knew exactly which drawer to look in, let this be your sign. Quiet women with long memories and good filing systems always get there in the end. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs it.